So I wrote a piece called Red Pills Without Roots for American Reformer maybe 2 years ago now. And there's three basic things, if I remember correctly, that I highlight in that. And I still think this is true. Um, Having observed from a ministerial perspective, I led a college career group, and actually I was involved in the conversion of a guy back in 2016 who was coming from the alt-right. And the three things were, number one, there is sort of a deracination element to this that I've criticized some of this because people, even me being on this show, like I'm getting all kinds of hate, I'm sure, online right now because like I've colored outside the lines and I'm sitting with Jeremy Boring and he's with the Daily Wire and the Daily Wire is owned by Jews or whatever. And there's like a very heavy tribal element here, and people find their sense of belonging and appreciation in these chat groups and things like that.
Oh, yeah.
Whereas I think of my belonging as rooted in organic things, my family, my region, my religion. So I think that that has become primary for some people with the advent on the online. The second element is their leaders have betrayed them. There's a sense that we've been lied to, we've been betrayed. 2020 really brought that out. And so a movement that gives you a transgressive ability and permission, I think, is very attractive. We're going to go kick back to the guys who betrayed you. And you know what they don't like? Well, they don't like Nazis. Let's talk about that. Or they seem to like Israel a lot. Let's really trash Israel. So I think there's an appeal there. And then thirdly, from the perspective of a lot of younger people, and they're not half wrong about this, the outlook for them is not the same as it was for their parents and grandparents economically and even socially. So a revolutionary movement that says, hey, you're a king. You get some muscles on you and we're going to take back everything that's been stolen. That's a very attractive idea. Those three things, I think, they animate what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Some of the things you just said aren't true. Like the economic outlook for Gen Z is great.
Oh, no, I mean from their perception, yeah.
That's right. They're being told that their economic outlook is terrible, and they're choosing, and I say choosing because I grant them some agency, not to say that they aren't actually being victimized, because they are, but they're ultimately choosing to believe it. They live in the greatest time of economic opportunity that's ever existed in all of human history. Every generation is always told that they're not going to have the economic opportunity that their fathers had. You don't have to go back in time. I'm not exaggerating this. If you go 10 years into the past, just the other day, every magazine, every newspaper, every newscast was about how the millennials were being left behind. They weren't going to get to live the American dream. They were going to be the first generation in American history who didn't have it as well as their parents had had it. You fast forward 10 years later, they're the richest generation in all of human history. They jumped past Gen X. They jumped past the boomers at the same age. The same thing will be true of Gen Z if we don't burn down the system in the meantime. They're going to be the most prosperous generation that's ever existed. They have the most opportunity in front of them right now that's ever existed. The voices that are feeding them this feeling of economic despair aren't doing so accidentally. That's a well-organized, well-funded political operation driving division in this country, which is one of the reasons that I think that it's funny that a lot of the young people who are accepting this argument that their country is bad frame themselves as being like, we're going to take it back. We're the true Americans. America was never about these bad ideas. America is us. We are real America. And it's like, well, you are real Americans. There's no question about that. But the thing that you're rejecting is also real America. And you're rejecting it, you think, because of its actual failures, when in reality, you're being used by people who want to destroy the thing that you claim to love. And they're using you as instruments to do it. Now, that's not to say that every criticism that Gen Z has of the country is ill-founded. No, obviously, the most effective lies are lies that are rooted in truth. We destroyed these kids' lives in 2020. We raised an entire generation of particularly white, particularly male Americans to be the villains in every story that we told them about the country and the world in which they live. We locked them behind computers for years at a time. We've allowed social media companies to intentionally develop, free from any regulation, the most addictive probably substance that's ever lived, which is the kind of social validation and dopamine that comes from social media. We've anonymized it and allowed it to become the actual breeding, or not the actual battlefield for all of these foreign influence operations and domestic political operations, but primarily, I think, foreign influence operations. So we have failed, and in doing so, we also made it impossible for young men to meet young women, which is, not going to be consequence free, because as it turns out, young men have particular drives that can't be satisfied. Well, I guess they can be satisfied behind a screen in a superficial sense, but over time, the superficiality of that kind of satisfaction becomes itself unsatisfying because man is more than meat. Those are very real criticisms. Those are the actual criticisms that are being exploited to generate an artificial revolutionary fervor, and that's the thing that really concerns me. And it's actually why we haven't gotten to this question yet, but now's probably as good a time as any. Why is it that the Jews, in particular, are the subject of the ire of all of these sort of diverse dissident movements? Like the thing that ultimately winds up uniting every faction of the dissident right is deep, deep, deep skepticism. I think that's probably being very generous in my language. Deep, deep skepticism of the Jews.
Well, for one thing, I mean, this has been pointed out. I think Doug Wilson has made this point before too, about he believes that it's jealousy, and I think there's definitely something to that. So if you are somebody who's feeling deracinated, or in the case of being currently online, if you are self-deracinated, you're sort of choosing to pretend like you have a different social group than who's actually around you, right? Yeah. And then you see this group of successful people who have a lot of social cohesion and take care of their families and seem to consistently be winning in all these different fields and ways. When you feel like you're losing, right? It becomes very easy to point to them as the root of all problems, right? And it's not a new phenomenon.
Sure, but just once I'd like somebody to blame the Mormons. They don't like to be called Mormons anymore. I try to be blame the LDS. They have close-knit families, social cohesion. They succeed at everything they do. They're super, super nice.
It may be coming down the pipe.
Yeah, I guess so.
Well, there's a couple different answers that I could give just from my reading based on this. Doug Wilson has another great answer about the innate spiritual knowledge that the sacrifice is coming from there. Like if the Christian story is true, then the sacrifice is coming from the Jews, from that corner. And if it's not Jesus, then it must be them more broadly. Hopefully, I'm doing justice to what he talked about. I think it was in the introduction to his interview with Tucker Carlson, of all people, actually. But historically, this is great because there's a book called A Rumor About the Jews by Stephen Eric Bronner. He's a professor at Rutgers. Some of the books I've listed, by the way, are written by people on the political left, because anti-Semitism on the right is not something that the right has largely talked about. The only book that I know about is In Search of Anti-Semitism by William F. Buckley. Not that there haven't been other articles and discussions of it, but I'm talking about books. So Stephen Eric Bronner, Dr. Bronner, talks about it this way, that it's kind of like the scapegoating function working at different levels of resolution. So when we were sort of in the medieval ages, if something was going wrong in the village, there's an illness or something like that, the crops die, you go and you blame the Jews over there in the ghetto, and so you go take your pitchforks, and you go and conduct the pogrom against the Jews over there. They're the scapegoat. When you get to the level of nationalism, if something's going wrong within the nation, it must be some outside force that's coming in and polluting your nation. This is kind of like the Nazi view, like the Jews were a polluting force in their pure Aryan blood and they needed to be exterminated, so coming from the outside. But now as we go to the level of globalism, who's the new scapegoat? Well, it's Israel, because now we're working on a global level. So people looking for a scapegoat that locks their worldview into place, they need a transcendent enemy to fixate on, someone to blame things on. And it's that psychological function, but operating at different levels of resolution throughout history.
Well, and it's a convenient way to escape the reality of the gospel by blaming it on deicide.
That's true.
Right. You don't have to deal with your own sin if you can blame it on the Jews.
That's
the
right.
Jews killed Christ, and that's a fundamentally truer statement than I killed Christ.
Yeah.
You're cooked.
That's right.
And all the implications of the gospel and your culture are nuked. Mm-hmm. And when all the implications of the gospel and your culture get nuked, you end up with Nazi Germany, you end up with who knows what.
Yeah, this is part of the fundamental problem with Christ is King as the political slogan, Christ is King. Because what you're ultimately saying is Christ is our guy and you killed our guy.
Right.
But no, you killed your guy.
Right.
It's like Christ,
right.
Are
you less responsible than the Jews?
Are you less responsible than the Jews? Right. Everybody likes to be the hero in their own story. Like definitely, if you had, been in Germany in the early 1940s, you would have hidden Anne Frank up in your attic. And definitely if you had been like in the early 1860s in the South, you would have been smuggling black people north of the Mason-Dixon line, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And definitely if you would have been like saying, free Barabbas or whatever, if you'd been standing outside Pilate's palace in Jerusalem, you're definitely one of the guys who would have been on Jesus' side, not like all those other losers like Peter.
Right.
Like you would have been one guy. You would have been John,
right.
the only guy who showed up for him.
Would have been right there.
It's just John plus you.
And some women.
And some women. Yeah,
I had a conversation with a guy one time about this, and he was using as proof text Pilate washing his hands, of saying that the Jews had a higher accountability. And I said, do you think that he successfully washed his hands of that? Like, when you read that, do you read, oh yeah, I'm Pilate. I'm the guy that said, yeah, it doesn't matter to me, not me, buddy.
Sorted.
I was like, that's when the theological angle of this becomes so real, is how easy it is to undermine the biblical truth of the gospel subtly, right? And most of the people that push this stuff don't have that conversation on that level. Joel Webben won't have that conversation on that level. Dale Partridge won't have that conversation. Corey Mallard won't have that conversation on that level. They will not do it. You won't find it.
If I could take from the just general evangelical perspective of someone who's gone from more of a normal, familiar view to a view of making the Jews almost like a substitute for original sin or something, because I've seen this happen. I had a teacher in my college career group I led years ago who was a teacher at the school that the Buffalo shooter went to. And if you read the manifesto for the Buffalo shooter, that was 2022, he says all the Jews should go to hell. And I asked her about, like, well, what happened? How did they get to this place? Well, they were writing essays, him and his friends, for a long time, blaming the Jews, talking about killing minorities and so forth. And the teachers didn't want to do anything. They didn't want to fight with parents. And so this thing snowballed, and it ended up with, unfortunately, 10 people dead. And that's like a very extreme example of it. But what was he believing? If you read the manifesto, or the manifesto from a few weeks ago, the one in California,
New Zealand, Buffalo.
Yeah.
You should read these all. They're hard to find online. If you need them, send me a message on Twitter.
Grok tells you, for some reason, if you just say, hey, find it for me.
Yeah.
But it seems like what happened in 2020 was there was a need for an explanation. But the world went crazy. This doesn't make any sense. People were going into QAnon or whatever they called it. I had some people I know that went that direction, but they were like trying to grasp an explanation that made sense of what happened. And there were a number of people that, and I know because I know some of them personally, who ended up starting to go down these internet channels where they'd say, hey, have you ever looked at something like Hollywood or pornography? And have you seen, Jews seem overrepresented in these particular fields. Maybe there's a conspiracy. Maybe they're working together to destabilize the culture. And then that's right when October 7th happened. And so there's all these images coming out of Gaza that look like a hellscape. And so people who are buying into this, well, the Jews might be behind a lot of the things that went wrong in 2020 and general subversion of culture. Now they're looking at, wow, that confirms it. Look what they just did to Gaza. And of course, they're getting their news from like Haaretz and like left-wing publications on what happened. But I think that's what's created the perfect storm here for a lot of people to now be ripe for, you know what, we've been subverted. I can't trust any of my leaders. I can't trust my pastor. They're actually rethinking biblical passages and how to interpret biblical passages, which we can get into if you want. But I think that's what's going on. And it starts kind of subtly, right? Because it starts with things like, I guess we've mentioned Joel Webben before, so just off the top of my head, just some things he said, things like, liberalism was crafted by Jews to undermine white civilization or white people. Or he said that JFK was the last president who said no to Israel.
Joel Webben has posted fake news articles written by fake people that do not exist with Jewish-sounding last names to get people to be mad at Jews.
Well, the one that takes the cake is the 440 hertz. That
That the music tone, the tone of C or whatever, I don't know.
It's A.
Okay, Calvin Robinson had a whole thing on this.
And Joel's nodding along and agreeing.
Yeah.
I posted online. I was just like, I refuse to believe this is real. This has to be AI. But yeah, they were talking about how the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds got together to help everyone get ready for war for Israel by changing A to make it higher so everyone would be aggravated and ready to go to war. And I'm like, what?
Can I share something quickly about that? In the New Age world, that's a whole big thing, like 440 versus 432 hertz, but the bad guys were the Nazis. So as soon as I saw Joel and Calvin Robinson talking about, no, it's the Jews, I was like, what is going on? Anyway, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to throw you.
I'm a musician, so it hurts me especially. I play 440 hertz every Sunday at church. Not because I want people to get ready for war for Israel, but
sure.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't think so. At least maybe that's what's happening. Yeah,
They got to you.
They got the call, and
You got the call. It's definitely for the rest of our lives, we're going to be dealing with the fact that the most arrogant people in the world, governments, decided to do an experiment. The experiment was shut down the earth. What if we just shut down the entire world, and then at a certain date in the future we'll turn it back on and see what happens? That's not the kind of thing that is done consequence free. I mean, it literally touched the majority of human beings on the planet, and particularly the youngest. It completely broke them in a psychological way at the most formative moments of their lives. created, exacerbated problems that already existed, fatherlessness and social media and loneliness, but you essentially locked people with those problems. And in some parts of the world, the most left-leaning parts of the world in particular, that prison lasted for years. I mean, you're talking about a prison that lasted 30 months in some cases for people. That's not something that we will not live to see the end of the consequences that flow from that.
Totally broke people's brains.
Completely broke people's brains.
Yeah, I think what's been really interesting for me to watch is the mainstreaming of conspiracy culture into now mainstream culture.
Yeah.
Like it used to be the conspiracy world was a fringe thing that you had to go looking for. And it was almost like there was a firewall. But then after COVID, with institutional collapse, suddenly conspiracy thinking itself became mainstream thinking, where the news isn't the news anymore, who did what, when, and where. Instead is, what could this possibly mean? What is it saying behind the scenes? And so conspiracy culture flooded into primarily the podcast world. And what I don't think that they know is that the foundations of American conspiracy culture go back to the early 1990s with Bill Cooper and his book Behold a Pale Horse, and then following after him a man named David Icke. These were the forefathers essentially of Alex Jones and Ian Carroll. But if you go back and you read Behold a Pale Horse, which is kind of at the foundations of American conspiracy culture, the last chapter of that book is a complete reprint of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. That's at the very foundations, and David Icke as well. And so as conspiracy culture moves into the mainstream, it brings with it this fictitious global conspiracy that the Jews are doing to enact world domination. And so that's the operating system that conspiracy culture is running on. Conspiracy culture is now mainstream culture. So I think that explains at least some of the fixation on the Jews. Everything is being controlled by some puppet group behind the scenes. Who's the most likely candidate historically? Well, it's always been the Jews, right? So,
and it never comes packaged with any sort of proposed solutions, realistically.
That's right.
It comes with the claim there are no political solutions.
Yeah, that's right.
It comes with the assertion that there's nothing that you can do that's going to solve this problem. Your enemies hate you and they want you and your family dead, and there's no political solution. What do you expect people to do when they hear that? Like, ironically, out of all the people that have pointed this out, there's an old clip from Nick Fuentes where he talks about this, and he talks about it in relation to trans shooters. And he talks about how transgender shooters are told the exact same thing from the left. He begins the monologue talking about that. He says, trans shooters are told all day long, the right wants to kill you, we do the walk for our lives, there's a trans genocide. Then you turn around and say that to white guys, and you say, there's a white genocide, they want all your families dead, there's no political solution. What do you expect them to do? You don't give them any sort of actionable alternative when you feed them this stuff. And so the people that are putting that out there without any sort of positive messaging for where to channel whatever frustration they're feeling, they're generating people like a Buffalo shooter, realistically. And we could say, nobody individually is at fault for that, which is true, other than the shooter, right? But this entire milieu, is creating that environment for these guys.
When you say no one is at fault,
on an individual basis, like I can't, assert, right?
That's right. There's legal culpability, and I am fairly liberal. I'm fairly liberal in a classical sense. I'm not of the left. I'm certainly of the right. In the American tradition of being of the right. But I believe in human freedom. I believe it is a theological concept. I believe it is a governing concept. I believe that people should be free. And at the end of the day, that's what liberalism ultimately espouses. And so it's very important to me on a legal level that we not ascribe legal culpability to people who don't have it. When people on the right sometimes say, consent consent doesn't equal moral. In reference to sex. I think that's true, but consent but you have to have a legal standard somewhere, and consent is the only meaningful legal standard that could actually be applied across a free country. And so consent matters. Consent has massive import, legal. It, of course, doesn't define the barriers of what's moral. And morality itself doesn't define the barriers of what's righteous, which is a whole other level of the conversation that nobody ever wants to engage in.
Let's go there.
But similarly with this idea of legal culpability versus moral culpability, sometimes in radicalization, people who are openly engaged in a project intended to radicalize people do have moral culpability when those people become radicalized. And I agree that they don't have legal culpability, because that would be an impossible standard that would only be abused by governments and would only be used as a way to clamp down on expression of ideas that are true. Of course, we know that that's a fact. But I don't want to I don't think that it ameliorates their moral culpability. Just that we can't put you in jail for it and shouldn't put you in jail for it. People are engaged in an actual project right now to radicalize a generation of Americans toward the destruction of our country as we know it. Not so that we can build a more perfect union, not so that we can see a better nation emerge as a result of it. It's ultimately so that we can see a nation emerge with it that's very broadly left-wing, except on social issues. And one of the, Tucker has actually talked about, if you go watch Tucker's monologue on Nicolas Maduro, in which he essentially defends Nicolas Maduro before, in the weeks leading up to the Trump administration removing Maduro from Venezuela. I mean, he says, yeah, he's a communist, but there's no gay marriage there. Abortion is illegal there.
Right.
That really is
Which is the same exact argument for the idea that the Third Reich was some sort of Christian paradise.
That's right.
Right. It's like, thousands, tens of thousands, millions of innocent people being murdered. They don't have cabaret shows in Berlin anymore.
That's right.
Like the perspective on it is skewed somewhat because a lot of people, their moral framing has been created by leftists to only understand immorality through the lens of what's leftist, right? They can't see sin for sin anymore. A lot of people, at least in the spaces like we're talking about. I see John nodding.
If I could steal man just for a second, maybe you can chew on this. I think the idea with, like Russell Kirk said about neo-Nazis, actually he was saying about old Nazis, paleo-Nazis, real Nazis.
They were neo at the time.
They were neo at the time. They were new when he said it, yeah. He said that they were revolutionaries and that they were a destructive force, essentially, which is very interesting. And he said they preyed upon the loneliness of the masses. And these were Weimar Republic conditions, essentially, that Nazism found an inroad in. And one of the things I keep hearing is that we are in Weimar Republic conditions, that this is just as bad. And usually the first thing brought up is sexual debauchery. There's no guidelines, there's no rules. And so the idea is that liberalism, or I should say it this way, liberal arrangements have been abused. Because I agree with you, as I don't know if we would miss each other, but I think there are liberal arrangements. For example, religious toleration created a pan-Protestant project instead of like a Church of England or so we have liberal arrangements, but liberalism seems to think that like these freedom solutions apply everywhere. Like the libertarian obviously goes to, we should just have prostitution and everything should be legal. And obviously there are limits to these things. So are we in a situation like the Weimar Republic? I'll throw it out there, I guess. Maybe we could talk about it, where you need these very hard totalitarian measures to come in and create order because it's chaos. I think that's what's being appealed to. And maybe with people whose lives are chaotic, they want order.
Well, I will say, like, we escaped the Roaring Twenties without becoming a totalitarian despot state.
That's right.
So you are correct in identifying that
FDR wasn't a no.
Well, yeah, I'm not prepped for that discussion. But no, you have a good point on that. But I like I said, I'll push back into the idea that we need that to overcome that. I don't think any of these systems work without mass regeneration of the population.
Amen.
Never is going to happen. If you have a country like America, any country, and you have almost no people that are regenerate believing Christians, there's no system you can put in place that is going to make that country operate in a way that reflects Christ and promotes righteousness in the population.
And of course, totalitarianism has the potential for a kind of social conservatism. It turns out when you give someone absolute authority, anything they don't like doesn't happen.
Right.
And so, yes, sometimes the totalitarian won't like certain things that you also don't like.
And you see tinges of this with even like the policies in Nazi Germany on abortion law. Right. Oh, people say, they banned abortion. They banned abortion in very specific ways, such that it only affects Aryans that can't get abortions, right? But you've got letters from Himmler writing internally about, hey, we need to alter some of these rules. We need to tweak these so that the Poles can kill their kids. Because they're not basing it on a biblical foundation of morality, right? And that's what happens when you have reactionaries. That's what happens when you have slop populism. You can elevate anybody who is of a totalitarian, authoritarian personality. And once that guy gets in there, if he's a Nietzschean freak show, you're screwed. And you have no other alternatives to be able to save your country. And people don't think about that because all they can see and think about is America's Weimar. America's Weimar. How do we fix Weimar? How do we fix Weimar?
And America is not Weimar.
They've been told
to answer the question, America is not Weimar.
That's what I was.
Right.
Yeah. I just want to draw a line of distinction that's kind of running through the conversation in a way. Like, it's one thing to talk about values within a sort of a secular or a non-religious context. But a big part of this conversation is what is proper thought, speech, and conduct for Christians.
Amen.
Right? And I don't hear that discussed enough. Like, okay, I can understand if the manosphere guys, want to go in that direction, Nietzschean, right? That they have their standard and they shouldn't go that way, but we'll let them go do that for a moment. But within a Christian men's conduct, there are standards that you're accountable to, right? Rejoice in all circumstances, suffering is redemptive. Like, these are all core parts of the Christian faith. And I see men throwing them out. First, I see big influencers like Joel Webben, for example, and plenty of others not talking about those regenerating, affections transforming parts of the faith that make it so distinctive in all of world history. They throw that out because they prefer something that suits their political project, which has nothing to do with again, as you said, regeneration in Christ. And so I think if we're going to be talking about Christian men, we should be talking about Christian standards for thought, speech, and conduct. And no one wants to have that conversation. The left doesn't want to have that conversation, and I get why. But the right should be excited to have that conversation, because it seems to me that the right's adherence to principles, to transcendent principles that are higher than them, is what distinguishes the right from the left. But I don't see that conversation happening, and it should be happening in a Christian space first and foremost.
Yeah, well, there's the softening in evangelicalism. Listen, I say often, evangelicalism is an American religion. It's approximately 100 years old. And like almost every religious tradition reflects the culture during which time it became ascendant.
Mm-hmm.
So Catholicism is hierarchical and monarchical, and even imperial, because it emerged in the Middle Ages. Like that is what it was. It reflected the culture from which it emerged. And the same is true now of evangelicalism in this country. Someone has accused me of saying, "You're saying Protestantism is only 100 years old?" No, I'm saying evangelicalism, as we understand it.
Neo-evangelicalism.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's
It's a
100.
very American reaction to consider those things the same thing.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
But evangelicalism, is efficient. It's loud. It's brash. It's sure of itself. It can be somewhat superficial because it's American. It's commodified. It's easy to export. We see it. It's all the things that America is in the 20th.
Visual.
It's visual. We don't build beautiful buildings because we hadn't been around long enough to build beautiful buildings, and because there is something beautiful about the very fact that we don't have to build a beautiful building in this country, because you start your church in a strip mall and you move to the school cafetorium until you hit 110 people, and then you move into the old Baptist church down the street because they moved into the new Baptist church. Like, there is something amazing about even our churches in this country are built to grow, and they're built to exceed their limitations. And yes, it's sad that we don't have beautiful 1,000-year-old cathedrals that certainly elevate the spirit. I mean, that is a thing that we've lost. Those churches haven't grown, though, in 500 years, right? They have only gotten emptier and emptier and emptier of anything except tourists over time. You go to the most beautiful cathedrals in England, which is where my heart soars. I'm not an Anglican, but I'm like aspirationally Anglican. Like, I wish I was Anglican, and I wish that the Anglicans believed in Christ. Like, because you go to the most beautiful Anglican cathedrals in the world, truly the most beautiful churches in the world, and they speak English. It's everything I want. And these women devote their lives to being custodians of these buildings. And if you ask them, if you try to talk to them about Jesus, they're like, truly, I've had this happen numerous times. They're like almost completely shocked. Like, you believe in all of this? I just have devoted my entire life to caring for this building because the building itself is so beautiful and culturally important, right? So evangelicalism has this sort of American tenor, and that's part of its charm and part of what's wrong with it. But as America has become softer, the evangelical church has become softer. It reflects the culture. And the softening of the evangelical church, the feminizing of the evangelical church, even in the last 20 years, has really accelerated. And it's no wonder that young men in particular don't find anything fulfilling about it. They don't believe that it's actually preparing them for the world that they're being born into.
Right. I mean, so you mentioned the buildings, which is interesting. So in your monologue earlier, you spoke about a video that was shared by one of these guys at New Christendom Press.
Yeah.
And in that same video that included all sorts of neo-Nazi imagery, there's an individual by the name of Jonathan Bowden, who is a Nietzschean, self-professed Nietzschean vitalist, pseudo-pagan of sorts, right? Died the last 10 years or whatever. And he talks about how the faith of old Christianity fit the Aryan mindset because it was all about these soaring cathedrals and becoming like God and like ascending to godhood. And like that was the part of Christianity that he liked as a Nietzschean.
Yeah.
But he talked about how modern Christianity, and I think this is always what real Christianity has been, has this sort of meekness to it, right? And this strength through that your strength comes from Christ, right? The opposite of the Nietzschean vitalist perspective. And he hated that, right? And so you see that not just in the architecture, but some of these ideological entities that are pouring into this stuff, like at New Christendom Press with Eric Kahn and some of these other guys. And I don't know how much they even consciously know that that's happening, but it is.
Yeah. It's very funny how we all take our modern conceits and sort of apply them to people who lived in the past. as though they could have possibly thought about things the way that we think about them. If you go to Jerusalem, there's two Jerusalems, really, two Christian Jerusalems. There's evangelical Jerusalem and there's historic Jerusalem. So you go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, right? And you see where everyone who's ever lived before America thinks that Jesus was crucified and resurrected. And then you go to the Garden Tomb, which is essentially where American evangelicals think that Jesus was resurrected, right? But you sort of understand it when if you can separate yourself from the tribal instinct. I'm not Catholic, I'm not Eastern Orthodox. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, to me, it feels dark and it smells funny, and it doesn't connect me to the moment at all.
Same.
But that's purely an aesthetic. That's purely an aesthetic statement, and it's an aesthetic that's rooted in my cultural experience. And so, you can imagine that if you were a Christian in, the 1400s or the 1500s, right? Your life was so different than ours. You only knew want. You only found fulfillment in family and geographic community because there was no other kind of community that was even possible. You were probably illiterate. I mean, the printing press put me a little bit before the printing press for this example. You smelled bad 100% of your life. You bathed annually against your will, right? Because it rained on you. Your wife stank. And you weren't immune to the fact that everybody stank. Everybody just stank. That was one of the things you dealt with in your life. You never got to eat meat. It's hard for Americans to understand that European peasantry did not eat meat. That part of what drew people to this country when America happened is, yes, economic freedom, but you could kill and eat an animal. The deer weren't owned by the crown. And people came over here and they became giants because suddenly, for the first time in centuries, men came over here, hunted and ate meat and got all of that protein and all of that energy. It's a huge part of what drew people to this continent. So it's hard for us to relate to them, but you can imagine that if you were a person like that, and then you walked into Canterbury Cathedral, and you've never been in a 2-story building, right? And here you have a building with, the ceiling that seems to reach to the heavens, stonework that has been being built across centuries, light pouring in through stained glass. Can you imagine what that feeling actually? You had to journey for days to get there. You didn't go there to church on Sunday. You made pilgrimage to get there, and your spirit would be lifted. The Genesis says again and again, lift up now thine eyes. Very literally, this place lifts up your countenance to heaven. What an unbelievable thing that the church provided to people through these unbelievable projects of art and artistry and architecture, that it gave them the opportunity to feel closer to God. How I live in a world where seeing Jesus walk on water wouldn't even be all that cool, because I saw Zod walk on water in Superman 2 when I was 5 years old. We live in a time where miracles are commonplace. We have CGI and special effects. We've all seen a trillion movies. We have the combined knowledge and wisdom of all of humanity available to us if we can just get past the porn. It's right there in our pockets at every possible moment. Anything you want to know is instantaneously available to you. You don't smell bad. You're rarely hot. You remember every time you ever sweat any time in your life, and it was character building. For me, and I have stairs that move themselves. I can stand on the stairs and the stairs take me up 3 stories at the shopping mall, where I can get anything that my heart could ever possibly desire for almost no money. For me, I sit at the Garden Tomb and I see, this is what it looked like. Maybe this isn't the tomb, probably isn't the tomb actually, where Christ was laid. But the tomb in which Christ was laid looked like this. There was a tomb just like that in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And they destroyed it to build the cathedral. Because from their point of view, seeing a hole in a rock wouldn't lift your spirits, even if it was the hole in the rock. You saw holes in rocks every day of your life. They actually tore down the tomb in which Jesus either was, or at least the tomb in which they thought he was laid, to build a church inside a church, because that's the thing that would lift your spirits. But as a modern evangelical American, you actually want to get in touch with the thing that you don't get to experience. You want to see the past. And so we're only having an aesthetic reaction in both instances. We're having an aesthetic reaction that in many ways is defined by our time. And we're ascribing to that aesthetic reaction our actual definition of factual truth. When in fact, probably both. I happen to think that God only recommends himself and never recommends us. So I think everything is basically the life of Brian. I think that the Garden Tomb isn't the tomb, and the tomb that they tore down also isn't the tomb, and there's probably like a grocery market right across from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre that's actually built over the tomb where Christ was. Because I think God's just amused like that we have these centuries long arguments over what was the actual hole in the actual rock, and he's like, God, it was never about the rock, and it was never about the hole in the rock, and you guys are crazy, and I'll just be right here waiting if you ever decide to lift up now thine eyes, right? But